A hush lay on the Laughing Valley now. Snow covered it like a white spread, and pillows of downy flakes drifted before the dwelling where Claus sat feeding the blaze of the fire. The brook gurgled on beneath a heavy sheet of ice, and all living plants and insects nestled close to Mother Earth to keep warm. The face of the moon was hid by dark clouds, and the wind, delighting in the wintry sport, pushed and whirled the snowflakes in so many directions that they could get no chance to fall to the ground. Claus heard the wind whistling and shrieking in its play, and thanked the good Knooks again for his comfortable shelter. Blinky washed her face lazily and stared at the coals with a look of perfect contentment. The toy cat sat opposite the real one and gazed straight ahead, as toy cats should. Suddenly Claus heard a voice that sounded different from the sound of the wind. It was more like a wail of suffering and despair. He stood up and listened, but the wind, growing boisterous, shook the door and rattled the windows to distract his attention. He waited until the wind was tired, and then, still listening, he heard once more the shrill cry of distress. Quickly he drew on his coat, pulled the cap over his eyes, and opened the door. The wind dashed in and scattered the embers over the hearth, at the same time blowing Blinky's fur so furiously that she crept under the table to escape. Then the door was closed, and Claus was outside, peering anxiously into the darkness. The wind laughed and scolded, and tried to push him over, but he stood firm. The helpless flakes stumbled against his eyes and dimmed his sight, but he rubbed them away and looked again. Snow was everywhere, white and glittering. It covered the earth and filled the air. The cry was not repeated. Claus turned to go back to the house, but the wind caught him unaware, and he stumbled and fell across a snowdrift. His hand plunged into a drift and touched something that was not snow. This he seized, and pulling it gently toward him, found it to be a child. The next moment he had lifted it in his arms and carried it into the house. The wind followed him through the door, but Claus shut it quickly. He laid the rescued child on the hearth, and brushing away the snow, he discovered it to be Weekum, a little boy who lived in a house beyond the valley. Claus wrapped a warm blanket around the little one and rubbed the frost from his limbs. Before long the child opened his eyes, and seeing where he was, smiled happily. And then Claus warmed milk and fed it to the boy slowly, while the cat looked on with somber curiosity. Finally the little one curled up in his friend's arms and sighed and fell asleep. And Claus, filled with gladness that he had found the wanderer, held him closely while he slumbered. The wind, finding no more mischief to do, climbed the hill and swept on toward the north. This gave the weary snowflakes time to settle down to the earth, and the valley became still again. The boy, having slept well in the arms of his friend, opened his eyes and sat up. And then, as a child will, he looked around the room and saw all that it contained. "Your cat is a nice cat, Claus," he said at last. "Let me hold it." But Blinky objected and ran away. "The other cat won't run, Claus," continued the boy. "Let me hold that one." And Claus placed the toy cat in his arms, and the boy held it lovingly and kissed the tip of its wooden ear. "How did you get lost in the storm, Weekum?" asked Claus. "I started to walk to my auntie's house, and I lost my way," answered Weekum. "Were you frightened?" "It was cold," said Weekum, "and the snow got in my eyes, so I couldn't see, and then I kept on until I fell in the snow without knowing where I was, and the wind blew the flakes over me and covered me up." Claus gently stroked his head, and the boy looked up at him and smiled. "I'm all right now," said Weekum. "Yes," replied Claus happily. "Now I will put you in my warm bed, and you will sleep until morning, when I will carry you back to your mother." "May the cat sleep with me?" asked the boy. "Yes, if you wish it to," answered Claus. "It's a nice cat," Weekum said, smiling, as Claus tucked the blankets around him, and presently the little one fell asleep with the wooden toy in his arms. When morning came, the sun claimed the Laughing Valley and flooded it with its rays. So Claus prepared to take the lost child back to its mother. "May I keep the cat, Claus?" asked Weekum. "It's nicer than real cats. It doesn't run away or scratch or bite. May I keep it?" "Yes, indeed," answered Claus, pleased that the toy he had made could give pleasure to the child. So he wrapped the boy and the wooden cat in a warm cloak, perching the bundle upon his own broad shoulders, and then he tramped through the snow and the drifts of the valley and across the plain beyond to the poor cottage where Weekum's mother lived. "See, Mama," cried the boy as soon as they entered, "I've got a cat." The good woman wept tears of joy over the rescue of her darling and thanked Claus many times for his kind act. So he carried a warm and happy heart back to his home in the valley. That night he said to Blinky, "I believe that children will love the wooden cats almost as well as the real ones, and they can't hurt them by pulling their tails and ears. So I'll make another." So this was the beginning of his great work. The next cat was better made than the first. While Claus sat whittling it out, the yellow rill came in to make him a visit, and so pleased was he with the man's skill that he ran away and brought several of his fellows. And there sat the red rill, the black rill, the green rill, the blue rill, and the yellow rill in a circle on the floor, while Claus whittled and whistled and the wooden cat grew into shape. "If it could be made the same color as the real cat, no one would know the difference," said the yellow rill, thoughtfully. "The little ones, maybe, would not know the difference," replied Claus, pleased with the idea. "I'll bring you some of the red that I color my roses and tulips with," cried the red rill, "and then you can make the lips and tongue red." "I'll bring some of the green that I color my grasses and leaves with," said the green rill, "and then you can color the cat's eyes green." "They'll need a bit of yellow also," remarked the yellow rill. "I must fetch some of the yellow I used to color my buttercups and goldenrods with." "The real cat is black," said the black rill. "I'll bring some of the black that I used to color the eyes of my pansies with, and then you can paint your wooden cat black." "I see you have a blue ribbon tied around Blinky's neck," added the blue rill. "I'll get some of the color that I used to paint bluebells and forget-me-nots with. And then you can carve a wooden ribbon on the toy cat's neck and paint it blue." So the rills disappeared, and by the time Claus had finished carving out the form of the cat, they were all back with the paints and brushes. They made Blinky sit upon the table so that Claus might paint the toy cat just the right color. And when the work was done, the rills declared it was exactly as good as a live cat. "That is, to all appearances," added the red rill. Blinky seemed a little offended by the attention bestowed upon the toy, and that she might not seem to approve of the imitation cat, she walked to the corner of the hearth and sat down with a dignified air. But Claus was delighted, and as soon as morning came he started out and tramped through the snow, across the valley and the plain, until he came to the village. There, in a poor hut near the walls of the beautiful palace of the Lord of Lurd, a little girl lay upon a wretched cot, moaning with pain. Claus approached the child and kissed her and comforted her, and then he drew the toy cat from beneath his coat where he had hidden it and placed it in her arms. Ah, how well he felt himself repaid for his labor and his long walk when he saw the little one's eyes grow bright with pleasure. She hugged the kitty tight to her breast, as if it had been a precious gem, and would not let it go for a single moment. The fever was quieted and the pain grew less, and she fell into a sweet and refreshing sleep. Claus laughed and whistled and sang all the way home. Never had he been so happy as on that day. When he entered the house, he found Shiegra, the lioness, awaiting him. Since his babyhood, Shiegra had loved Claus, and while he dwelt in the forest, she had often come to visit him at Nisiel's bower. After Claus had gone to live in the Laughing Valley, Shiegra became lonely and ill at ease, and now she had braved the snowdrifts, which all lions abhor, to see him once more. Shiegra was getting old, and her teeth were beginning to fall out, while the hairs that tipped her ears and tail had changed from tawny yellow to white. Claus found her lying on his hearth, and he put his arms around the neck of the lioness and hugged her lovingly. The cat had retired into a far corner. She did not care to associate with Shiegra. Claus told his old friend about the cats he had made, and how much pleasure they had given Weekum and the sick girl. Shiegra did not know much about children. Indeed, if she had met a child, she would scarcely be trusted not to eat it. But she was interested in Claus's new labors, and said, "These images seem to me very attractive. Yet I cannot see why you should make cats, which are very unimportant animals. Suppose now that I am here, you make an image of a lioness, the queen of all beasts. Then indeed your children will be happy and safe at the same time." Claus thought this was a good suggestion, so he got a piece of wood and sharpened his knife, while Shiegra crouched upon the hearth at his feet. With much care he carved the head in the likeness of the lioness, even to the two fierce teeth that curved over her lower lip and the deep frowning lines above her wide-open eyes. When it was finished, he said, "You have a terrible look, Shiegra." "Then the image is like me," she answered, "for I am indeed terrible to all who are not my friends." And Claus now carved out the body, with Shiegra's long tail trailing behind it. The image of the crouching lioness was very lifelike. "It pleases me," said Shiegra, yawning and stretching her body gracefully. "Now I will watch while you paint." And he brought the paints the Ryls had given him from the cupboard and colored the image to resemble the real Shiegra. The lioness placed her big padded paws upon the edge of the table and raised herself, while she carefully examined the toy that was her likeness. "You are indeed skillful," she said proudly. "The children will like that better than cats, I'm sure." Then snarling at Blinky, who arched her back in terror and whined fearfully, she walked away towards her forest home in stately strides. The winter was over now, and all the Laughing Valley was filled with joyous excitement. The brook was so happy at being free once again that it gurgled more boisterously than ever, and dashed so recklessly against the rocks that it sent showers of spray high in the air. The grass thrust its sharp little blades upward through the mat of dead stalks where it had hidden from the snow. But the flowers were yet too timid to show themselves, although the Ryls were busy feeding their roots. The sun was in remarkably good humor, and sent his rays dancing merrily through the valley. Claus was eating his dinner one day when he heard a timid knock on his door. "Come in," he called. No one answered, but after a pause came another rapping. Claus jumped up and threw open the door. Before him stood a small girl, holding a smaller brother fast by the hand. "Is you Claus?" she asked shyly. "Indeed I am, my dear," he answered with a laugh, as he caught both children in his arms and kissed them. "You are very welcome, and you have come just in time to share my dinner." He took them to the table and fed them with fresh milk and nut cakes. When they had eaten enough, he asked, "Why have you made this long journey to see me?" "I want a tat," replied little Mary, and her brother, who had not yet learned to speak many words, nodded his head and exclaimed like an echo, "Tat!" "Oh, you want my toy cats, do you?" returned Claus, greatly pleased to discover that his creations were so popular with children. The little visitors nodded eagerly. "Unfortunately," he continued, "I have but one cat now ready, for I carried 2 to children in the town yesterday, and the one I have shall be given to your brother, Mary, because he is smaller, and the next one I make will be for you." The boy's face was bright with smiles as he took the precious toy that Claus held out to him, but little Mary covered her face with her arm and began to sob grievously. I want a tat now," she wailed. Her disappointment made Claus feel miserable for a moment, and then he suddenly remembered Shiegra. "Don't cry, darling," he said soothingly. "I have a toy much nicer than a cat, and you shall have that." He went to the cupboard and drew out the image of the lioness, which he placed on the table before Mary. The girl raised her arm and gave one glance at the fierce teeth and glaring eyes of the beast, and then, uttering a terrified scream, she rushed from the house. The boy followed her, also screaming lustily and even dropping his precious cat in fear. For a moment Claus stood motionless, being puzzled and astonished. Then he threw Shiegra's image back into the cupboard and ran after the children, calling to them not to be frightened. Little Mary stopped in her flight, and her brother clung to her skirt, but they both cast fearful glances at the house, until Claus had assured them many times that the beast had been locked in the cupboard. "Yet why were you so frightened at seeing it?" he asked. "It's only a toy to play with." "It's bad," said Mary decidedly, and just horrid, not a bit nice like cats." "Perhaps you are right," returned Claus thoughtfully, "but if you will return with me to the house, I will soon make you a pretty cat." So they timidly entered the house again, having faith in their friend's words, and afterward they had the joy of watching Claus carve out a cat from a bit of wood and paint it in natural colors. It did not take him long to do this, for he had become skillful with his knife by this time, and Mary loved her toy all the more dearly because she had seen it made. After his little visitors had trotted away on their journey homeward, Claus sat long in deep thought, and he then decided that such fierce creatures as his friend the lioness would never do as models from which to fashion his toys. There must be nothing to frighten the dear babies, he reflected, and while I know Shiegra well and am not afraid of her, it is natural that children should look upon her image with terror. Hereafter I will choose such mild-mannered animals as squirrels and rabbits and deer and lambkins from which to carve my toys, and then the little ones will love rather than fear them. He began his work that very day, and by bedtime had made a wooden rabbit and a lamb. They were not quite so lifelike as the cats had been, because they were formed from memory, while Blinky had sat very still for Claus to look at while he worked. But the new toys pleased the children nevertheless, and the fame of Claus's playthings quickly spread to every cottage on plain and in village. He always carried his gifts to the sick or crippled children, but those who were strong enough walked to the house in the valley to ask for them, so a little path was soon worn from the plain to the door of the toy-maker's cottage. First came the children who had been the playmates of Claus, before he had begun to make toys. And these, you may be sure, were well supplied. Then children who lived farther away heard of the wonderful images and made journeys to the valley to secure them. All the little ones were welcome, and never a one went away empty-handed. This demand for his handiwork kept Claus busily occupied, but he was quite happy in knowing the pleasure it gave to so many of the dear children. His friends the immortals were pleased with his success and supported him bravely. The Knooks selected for him clear pieces of soft wood, so his knife might not be blunted in cutting them, and the Ryls kept him supplied with paints of all colors and brushes fashioned from the tips of timothy grasses. The fairies discovered the workmen needed saws and chisels and hammers and nails, as well as knives, and brought him a goodly array of such tools. Claus soon turned his living room into a most wonderful workshop. He built a bench before the window and arranged his tools and paints so that he could reach everything as he sat on his stool, and as he finished toy after toy to delight the hearts of little children, he found himself growing so happy that he could not refrain from singing and laughing and whistling all the day long. "It's because I live in Laughing Valley, where everything else laughs," said Claus. But that was not the reason. One day, as Claus sat before his door to enjoy the sunshine while he busily carved the head and horns of a toy deer, he looked up and discovered a glittering cavalcade of horsemen approaching the valley. When they drew nearer, he saw that the band consisted of a score of men-at-arms, clad in bright armor and bearing in their hands spears and battle-axes. In front of these rode little Bessie Blithesome, the pretty daughter of the proud Lord of Lurd who had once driven Claus from his palace. Her palfrey was pure white, its bridle was covered with glittering gems, and its saddle draped with cloth of gold, richly embroidered. The soldiers were sent to protect her from harm while she journeyed, and Claus was surprised, but he continued to whittle and to sing until the cavalcade drew up before him. And then the little girl leaned over the neck of her palfrey and said, "Please, Mr. Claus, I want a toy." Her voice was so pleading that Claus jumped up at once and stood before her, but he was puzzled how to answer her request. "You're a rich lord's daughter," said he, "and you have all that you desire." "Except toys," added Bessie. "There's no toys in all the world but yours." "And I make them for the poor children who have nothing else to amuse them," continued Claus. "Do poor children love to play with toys more than rich ones?" asked Bessie. "I suppose not," said Claus thoughtfully. "Am I to blame because my father's a lord? Must I be denied the pretty toys that I long for just because other children are poorer than I?" she inquired earnestly. "I'm afraid you must, dear," he answered, "for the poor have nothing else with which to amuse themselves. You have your pony to ride, your servants to wait on you, and every comfort that money can procure." "But I want toys," answered Bessie, wiping away the tears that forced themselves into her eyes. "If I cannot have them, I shall be very unhappy." Claus was troubled, for her grief recalled to him the thought that his desire was to make all children happy, without regard to their condition in life. Yet while so many poor children were clamoring for his toys, he could not bear to give one of them to Bessie Blithesome, who had so much already to make her happy. "Listen, my child," he said gently. "All the toys I am now making are promised to others, but the next shall be yours, since your heart so longs for it. Come to me again in 2 days, and it shall be ready for you." And Bessie gave a cry of delight, and leaning over her pony's neck, she kissed Claus prettily upon his forehead, and then calling to her men-at-arms, she rode gaily away, leaving Claus to resume his work. "If I am to supply the rich children as well as the poor ones," he thought, "I shall not have a spare moment in the whole year. But is it right that I should give to the rich? Surely I must go to Necile and talk with her about this matter." So when he had finished the toy deer, which was very like the deer he had known in the forest glades, he walked into Burzee and made his way to the bower of the beautiful nymph Necile, who had been his foster mother. She greeted him tenderly and lovingly, listening with interest to his story of the visit of Bessie Blithesome. "And now tell me," said he, "shall I give toys to rich children?" "We of the forest know nothing of riches," she replied. "It seems to me that one child is like another child, since they're all made of the same clay, and that riches are like a gown, which may be put on or taken away, leaving the child unchanged. But the fairies are guardians of mankind, and know mortal children better than I. Let us call the Fairy Queen." This was done, and the Queen of the Fairies sat beside them and heard Claus relate his reasons for thinking that rich children could get along without toys, and also what the nymph had said. "Necile is right," declared the Queen, "for whether it be rich or poor, a child's longings for pretty playthings are but natural. Rich Bessie's heart may suffer with as much grief as poor Mary's, and she can be just as lonely and discontented, or just as gay and happy, I think. Friend Claus, it's your duty to make all little ones glad, whether they chance to live in palaces or in cottages." "Your words are wise, fair Queen," replied Claus, "and my heart tells me that they are as just as they are wise. Hereafter all children may claim my services." Then he bowed before the gracious fairy, and kissing Necile's lips, he went back to his valley. At the brook he stopped for a drink, and afterward he sat on the bank and took a piece of moist clay in his hands, while he thought about what sort of toy he could make for Bessie Blithesome. He did not notice that his fingers were working the clay into shape until, glancing downward, he found that he had unconsciously formed a head that bore a slight resemblance to the nymph Necile. At once he became interested. Gathering more of the clay from the bank, he carried it to his house, and then with the aid of his knife and a bit of wood, he succeeded in working the clay into the image of a toy nymph. With skillful strokes he formed long waving hair into the head, and covered the body with a gown of oak leaves, while the 2 feet sticking out at the bottom of the gown were clad in sandals. But the clay was soft, and Claus found that he must handle it gently to avoid ruining his pretty work. Perhaps the rays of the sun will draw out the moisture and cause the clay to become hard, he thought, so he laid the image on a flat board and placed it in the glare of the sun. This done, he went to his bench and began painting the toy deer, and he became so interested in the work that he forgot all about the clay nymph. The next morning, happening to notice it as it lay on the board, he found the sun had baked it to the hardness of stone, and it was strong enough to be safely handled. Claus now painted the nymph with great care to the likeness of Necile, giving it deep blue eyes, white teeth, rosy lips, and ruddy brown hair. The gown he colored oak leaf green, and when the paint was dry, Claus himself was charmed with the new toy. Of course it was not nearly so lovely as the real Necile, but considering the material of which it was made, Claus thought it was very beautiful. When Bessie, riding upon her white palfrey, came to his dwelling the next day, Claus presented her with the new toy. The little girl's eyes were brighter than ever as she examined the pretty image, and she loved it at once, and held it close to her breast as a mother does with her child. "What is it called, Claus?" she asked. Now Claus knew that nymphs do not like to be spoken of by mortals, so he could not tell Bessie it was an image of Necile that he had given her. But as it was a new toy, he searched his mind for a name to call it by, and the first word he thought of, he decided would do very well. "It's called a dolly, my dear," he said to Bessie. "I shall call the dolly my baby," returned Bessie, kissing it fondly, "and I shall tend it and care for it just as nurse cares for me. Thank you very much, Claus. Your gift has made me happier than I've ever been before." And she rode away, hugging the toy in her arms. And Claus, seeing her delights, thought that he would make another dolly, better and more natural than the first. He brought more clay from the brook, and remembering that Bessie had called the dolly her baby, he resolved to form this one into a baby's image. That was no difficult task to the clever workman, and soon the baby dolly was laying on the board and placed in the sun to dry. Then, with the clay that was left, he began to make an image of Bessie Blithesome herself. This was not so easy, for he found that he could not make the silken robe of the Lord's daughter out of common clay. So he called the fairies to his aid and asked them to bring him colored silks with which to make a real dress for the clay image. The fairies set off at once on their errand, and before nightfall had returned with a generous supply of silks and laces and golden threads. And Claus now became impatient to complete his new dolly, and instead of waiting for the next day's sun, he placed the clay image upon the hearth and covered it with glowing coals. By morning, when he drew the dolly from the ashes, it had baked as hard as if it had lain a full day in the hot sun. Now our Claus became a dressmaker as well as a toy maker. He cut the lavender silk and neatly sewed it into a beautiful gown that just fit the new dolly, and he put a lace collar around its neck and pink silk shoes on her feet. The natural color of the baked clay is a light gray, but Claus painted the face to resemble the color of flesh, and he gave the dolly Bessie's brown eyes and golden hair and rosy cheeks. It was really a beautiful thing to look upon, and sure to bring joy to some childish heart. While Claus was admiring it, he heard a knock at his door, and little Mary entered. Her face was sad, and her eyes red with continued weeping. "Why, what has grieved you, my dear?" said Claus, taking the child in his arms. I broke my tat," sobbed Mary. "How?" he inquired, his eyes twinkling. "I dropped him and broke off his tail, and then I dropped him and it broke off his ear, and now he's all spoilt." Claus laughed. "Never mind, Mary dear," he said. "How would you like this new dolly instead of a cat?" And Mary looked at the silk-robed dolly, and her eyes grew big with astonishment. "Oh, Claus," she cried, clapping her small hands together with rapture, "I can have the beautiful lady?" "Do you like it?" he asked. "I love it," said she. "It's better than tats." "Then take it, dear, and just be careful not to break it." And Mary took the dolly with a joy that was almost reverent, and her face dimpled with smiles as she started along the path toward home.